I'll never forget the day I first found out about Kayla's betrayal, way back when we just started our lives as new parents. I'd always been someone who believed in trust, never one to dig around in someone else's life. But as the weeks went on, things started feeling off. It was subtle at first. Kayla would come home later than usual, claiming she'd had to stay late at work or that she'd met a friend for a drink. I brushed it off, giving her the benefit of the doubt because, at that time, I truly didn't want to see anything wrong. After all, we had just had our first child, and I wanted that family image to be flawless. But after a while, her story started sounding rehearsed. It was like she was telling me lines she'd memorized, looking at me just a bit too carefully to see if I was buying them. Still, I told myself she'd never do anything to hurt us. I wanted to be wrong. Then, I got a call from one of her colleagues, a mutual acquaintance who, in a blunt and disgusted tone, warned me something was going on. He didn't give me details right away, just told me I might want to keep an eye on her. That's when the seed of doubt finally took root. But even as I began noticing the signs, I still wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt, hoping I was misreading everything. The doubt ate at me. I'd catch myself watching her from across the room, noticing the way she'd keep her phone angled just so, or how she'd keep glancing down at it, smiling at messages that were just from friends. When I asked who, her answers were vague, like she was keeping something back but daring me to notice. She was so good at making me feel like I was the one being unreasonable if I questioned her. One night, when she said she'd be home late, I decided to call her workplace just to check in, but the receptionist said she had left hours ago. When she finally got home, her makeup was smudged, and she looked surprised to see me awake. I asked how work had gone, watching her closely. She didn't even blink, just said it had been the usual. I felt a mix of frustration and hurt bubbling up, but I kept calm, acting like I hadn't noticed anything. But inside, it felt like my gut was twisting into knots. Days passed, and the feeling only grew stronger. It became a constant weight, knowing something wasn't right but having no solid proof. Finally, one evening, Kayla told me she had an urgent meeting she had to get to, one that had apparently come up at the last minute. I smiled and told her to have a good night, but the moment she walked out the door, I grabbed my keys and followed her. I kept a good distance as I followed her car, my heart pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. She drove right past her office, not even slowing down. Instead, she headed across town to a small bar on the outskirts, one of those places we'd never gone together. She parked, checked her reflection in the mirror, and fixed her hair, looking like she was ready for a date. My stomach churned as I watched her head inside, her eyes scanning the crowd until they locked on someone across the room. I waited a few minutes before slipping out of the car, watching her through the large windows of the bar. I couldn't make out the face of the man she joined, but I could see her smile, so genuine, so warm. And that smile twisted something deep inside me. She laughed, leaned closer, and rested a hand on his arm, like they'd done this 100 times before. All those nights, she'd come home to me with excuses flashed through my mind. Each one stung worse than the last, and I wondered how I could have let myself ignore the signs for so long. After about an hour, they left together. They didn't see me, but I trailed them as they walked down the street, arms brushing against each other, Kayla tossing glances his way like she was a teenager again. They disappeared into a small hotel on the corner, and that was the final nail. I knew then that she'd crossed the line. More than once, it seemed, and it had all been hidden in plain sight. I drove around aimlessly for what felt like hours, replaying everything in my head. It was like seeing the last few years of our marriage through a new lens, and every memory felt like it was stained by her lies. I wondered how long she'd been doing this, how many times she'd slipped out with some excuse while I'd been home, taking care of our son, trusting her. Eventually, I ended up parked outside our house. The lights were off, our home dark and quiet, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside me. I sat there, watching the house we'd built together, thinking of everything we'd shared. Our son was sleeping just inside those walls, blissfully unaware that the foundation of his family was crumbling. And for a moment, I felt guilty for even thinking of breaking it apart. When she finally came home hours later, she didn't see me sitting in the car. She just walked in, her shoes in hand, trying to be quiet so she wouldn't wake me, or so she thought. I waited a few minutes, letting her settle in before I went inside. I found her in the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of water, her eyes widening when she saw me. She managed a weak smile, clearly startled, and I could almost see the wheels turning in her head as she tried to come up with an explanation. I didn't say anything. I just looked at her, waiting for her to fill the silence. She shifted uncomfortably, clearly thrown off by my presence, But eventually she just shrugged and said she'd had a long night at work. I kept my face blank, just nodded and replied, "Must have been exhausting." She didn't look at me as she took a sip of water, and I could see her mind working, probably wondering if I'd bought it. Part of me wanted to confront her right then and there, to tell her I'd followed her, watched her with that man, seen her lies firsthand. But something held me back. I wasn't done putting the pieces together. I wanted to know exactly how deep this ran. Over the next few days, I watched her more carefully than I ever had. I noticed the patterns, the sudden phone calls she'd take in the other room, the small lies about where she'd been, the way she'd stay late at work for meetings that apparently didn't have a fixed end time. And yet, every time she'd come home, she'd walk in as if nothing was amiss, like she hadn't just betrayed everything we'd built. Her confidence in her lies was almost impressive, like she'd become so practiced that even her conscience didn't flinch. One night, as she was in the shower, I went through her phone. She usually kept it close, but tonight she'd left it unattended, and I wasn't about to let the opportunity slip by. As I scrolled through her messages, my worst fears were confirmed. There were texts too, and from the man I'd seen her with, the two of them talking in codes, making plans, checking each other's schedules. She'd even saved his number under a woman's name, Rachel. But it was painfully obvious what they were to each other. The messages stretched back further than I expected. Some dating months, even a year. They spoke with an ease, a familiarity, that made my stomach churn. She told him things she hadn't told me in years, small, seemingly insignificant details about her day, her frustrations, her hopes for the future. She shared parts of herself with him that I thought were ours alone. There were inside jokes, plans for future dates, and messages about how much they missed each other when they couldn't meet. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional too, and somehow that made it worse. One exchange stood out, haunting me even after I put the phone down. They'd been talking about a new restaurant that had just opened downtown. She was excited about trying it, telling him how it sounded like the perfect spot for a romantic evening. I remembered mentioning that same restaurant to her weeks ago, suggesting we go for our anniversary, and she brushed it off, saying it wasn't her style. But here she was, eagerly planning to experience it with someone else. The intimacy of their conversations hit me like a tidal wave. It wasn't just the secrecy or the betrayal. It was the realization that she was giving him the attention, the excitement, and the connection that she used to share with me. I read her messages over and over, my hands trembling as I tried to make sense of it all. How had it come to this? When had I become an afterthought in her life? It was like looking at a stranger, someone I didn't recognize, and yet it was the same woman I'd spent years building a life with. I could almost hear her voice as I read the messages, the way she used to speak to me when we first fell in love. The thought that she was using that same tenderness, that same affection, for someone else made my chest ache. I felt betrayed on a level I hadn't known was possible. It wasn't just that she'd lied. It was the depth of the deception, the care she'd put into creating a new life outside of ours. When I finally heard the water stop in the shower, I snapped out of my daze and quickly put her phone back on the nightstand. My hands were still shaking as I stood up, trying to steady myself before she walked in. The sound of her footsteps drew closer, and I forced myself to look composed, even as my mind raced with everything I'd just uncovered. As she walked into the room, toweling off her hair, she smiled at me, casual and unbothered, as if she hadn't been living a double life. "Hey," she said lightly, her tone warm, the same way it had always been. I muttered a response, not trusting myself to say more. The knowledge of her betrayal was now burned into my mind, and every word out of her mouth felt hollow, every glance tainted by the lies I now knew she'd been telling. I couldn't stop thinking about all the times she'd looked me in the eye and told me she loved me, how she'd held my hand and promised we'd grow old together. I replayed those moments in my head, but now they felt like echoes of a distant past, twisted and empty. The words I'd trusted so deeply now felt like a cruel joke, a mask she'd worn while giving her heart to someone else. I didn't confront her, not yet. Instead, I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, the weight of everything I'd uncovered pressing down on me. I knew I couldn't let this go, but I needed time to process it, to figure out what to do next. For now, I let her believe I was none the wiser, but inside, something had shifted. My trust, my love, my faith in her. It was all unraveling, one thread at a time. The next morning, I woke up with a determination that felt new and raw. I knew I needed something more than just snippets of text on her phone. Those words had given me a glimpse into her secret life, but it wasn't enough. I had to see the affair for what it truly was, stripped of shadows and doubt. I wanted the whole picture, with every detail laid bare. No what-ifs or second-guessing. It felt like my mind wouldn't settle until I had it. So, later that day, I went to an electronics store, feeling the weight of each step as I made my way through the aisles. I kept glancing around, as if every stranger passing by knew the painful truth of why I was there. After a bit of searching, I found what I needed: a small voice recorder and a compact tracking device. Holding them in my hands, I felt a pang of guilt and shame, a hollow feeling in my chest as I realized what our marriage had come to. We were supposed to be partners, not spies in each other's lives. But I knew that without these things, I'd be left in the dark, plagued by the possibility of betrayal without the means to prove it. When I got home that evening, I wasted no time. I waited until Kayla was out of the room, then went to the garage where her car sat quietly, as if it too held secrets. I carefully hid the voice recorder in a place I was sure she'd never notice, making sure it was secure but completely out of sight. Every movement felt surreal, like I was some character in a bad movie about suspicion and deceit. Once the recorder was set, I went back inside, my heart racing. The tracking device was easier, slipping it into her purse when she wasn't looking, right between her makeup bag and a handful of loose change. I felt wrong doing it, like I was crossing some line, but I forced myself to push through the discomfort. This was the only way I'd know the truth for certain, and I told myself I deserved that much. The following morning, Kayla was up before dawn, getting ready with an almost cheerful efficiency that I hadn't seen in a long time. She seemed almost energized, a lightness in her steps that I hadn't noticed in months, maybe years. She kissed me on the cheek with a practiced smile and a casual, "See you tonight," and then she was gone. I watched her go, feeling the familiar twist of heartbreak and anger, knowing that whatever she'd planned for today had nothing to do with work. Once she was out the door, I pulled out my phone, opening the tracking app and waiting for her location to appear on the map. I could see her little dot moving steadily across town, away from her office. My heart pounded as I watched, the truth creeping in with every mile she drove. It wasn't long before the dot came to a stop on the other side of town, parked outside a small cafe nestled between a row of shops. I recognized it from her messages, the cafe she'd mentioned as their meeting spot. And there it stayed. Hours went by, and she didn't move. I could practically picture her inside, sitting across from him, sharing that easy laughter I hadn't heard from her in months. I thought of all the times she claimed she was swamped at the office, the way she'd come home late, breezing in with a quick excuse and a distant smile. But now, watching that little dot unmoving on my screen, I knew where she was and who she was with, and I could feel the reality of it sinking in, no longer just a suspicion or a shadow. I went about my day with a numbness I hadn't felt before, carrying on with work, phone calls, and tasks as if nothing had changed. But in the back of my mind, I kept glancing at the tracker, watching for any hint of movement. Eventually, near the end of the day, the dot began to move again, drifting slowly toward another location. My stomach dropped when I saw where it stopped next, a hotel on the outskirts of town. My heart dropped as I watched the dot come to a stop. There it was, the undeniable confirmation I'd been both dreading and expecting. She hadn't even bothered to hide it, hadn't been cautious enough to cover her tracks. It was as if she was so certain I'd never question her that she felt she could carry on with her affair in broad daylight, confident I'd never be the wiser. I'd had suspicions for weeks, but seeing it on the screen, watching that dot sit still at a hotel for the better part of an hour, made it impossible to deny. That night, after she came home, I put on a calm mask and waited. Once she'd settled in, I slipped out to listen to the recordings from the hidden device I'd left in her car. Part of me didn't want to hear it, didn't want those suspicions confirmed in such a personal, unfiltered way. But I needed to know how far this had gone. The sound was muffled, the device picking up more ambient noise than I'd hoped. But it was enough. I could hear her laughter, soft and breathy, her voice dropping to a low, intimate tone I hadn't heard in years. She giggled at something he'd said, the sound warm and flirtatious. It struck me that she hadn't laughed like that with me in, I couldn't even remember when. The Kayla I was hearing sounded like a different person entirely, carefree, playful, affectionate in a way she rarely was anymore. And to think, that same woman would walk through our front door and greet me as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just spent hours sharing her warmth with someone else. When she finally did come home that evening, it felt surreal to see her in our home, stepping into the life we'd built as if her betrayal were just another part of her day. She opened the door with a bright, rehearsed smile and immediately launched into an excuse about her long day and the work crisis that had apparently kept her busy. She was so casual, so at ease with the lie, that I almost felt like a stranger in my own marriage. I forced myself to nod along, listening to her words with a calm I didn't feel. As she rattled off the details of her fictitious day, I couldn't help but notice how easily the lies rolled off her tongue, each one carefully crafted to cover her tracks. It was as though this had become routine for her, the same way going to the office or cooking dinner might be for anyone else. Every word she spoke, every hollow excuse she offered, only served to harden my resolve. I knew that soon I would confront her, and I would get the truth out of her directly, face to face. No more hiding. I didn't say much that night, just nodded in agreement, occasionally offering a vague comment or question to keep her talking. But my mind was churning, every quiet and sounds rough, masking the storm brewing inside me. I let her go on, feeding me lie after lie, each one strengthening my resolve to confront her head-on. The next few days felt like a blur, a strange mix of normalcy and quiet determination. On the surface, I played the part of the clueless husband, nodding along to Kayla's increasingly polished lies about her busy schedule and late nights at work. Inside, though, I was anything but clueless. Every time she left the house, I checked the tracker on my phone, noting her movements. I listened to snippets of the recordings from her car, piecing together her routine. It was like unraveling a thread, one lie leading seamlessly into another, as if she'd rehearsed it all down to the last detail. The more I watched and listened, the more patterns emerged. She was methodical, careful not to leave obvious gaps, but the cracks were there if you looked closely enough. Her meetings always seemed to run a bit longer than necessary, her last-minute errands conveniently taking her to the same part of town where he lived. I could almost predict when her phone would buzz with another excuse, her voice just the right mix of rushed and apologetic as she fed me yet another fabrication. I kept telling myself I needed more time, more evidence, but the truth was, I was stalling. Coming to terms with the depth of her betrayal wasn't just painful, it was exhausting. I would lie awake at night replaying her words, her excuses, her hollow reassurances that she loved me. And yet, during the day, I continued to gather proof, not just to confront her, but to make sense of how we had gotten here. One morning, while reviewing the latest recording, I heard her laugh. It was light, carefree, the kind of laugh that used to make my heart skip when we first met. But this laugh wasn't for me, it was for him. She was talking to him in the car, her voice full of warmth and energy, teasing him about something I couldn't quite make out. That sound, that intimacy between them, hit me harder than any evidence I'd uncovered so far. It was the kind of laugh she hadn't shared with me in years, and it broke something inside me. That afternoon, I decided enough was enough. I couldn't keep playing along while she carried on with her double life. I'd spent enough time collecting proof, enough nights agonizing over her betrayal. Something in me snapped, and I resolved that tonight, I would confront her. I'd let the truth come out and force her to face what she'd done. When she walked through the door that evening, she greeted me with her usual smile, the same polished expression she'd worn every night since this all began. She set her bag down, brushing her hair back casually, and started talking about her hectic day. But this time, I didn't nod along. I didn't ask her how work went or pretend to listen to her excuses. I just stood there, watching her. It didn't take long for her to notice that something was off. She faltered mid-sentence, her smile slipping as she looked at me more closely. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her voice tentative, almost wary. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. My hands were clenched at my sides, but I kept my voice calm. "We need to talk," I said, the words heavy with everything I'd been holding back. Her eyes widened slightly, the first flicker of unease crossing her face. She opened her mouth to respond, but I held up a hand, stopping her. "Not here," I said, nodding toward the living room. "Sit down." For the first time in weeks, I saw her confidence waver. She hesitated, then moved slowly toward the couch, her movements cautious. I followed, my mind racing with everything I wanted to say, every question I needed answered. This was it, the moment of reckoning. "What's this about?" she asked, her voice tight but even, as if trying to sound confused rather than defensive. It was almost impressive, the way she kept her tone steady, her expression blank, but I knew her too well. The way her shoulders stiffened ever so slightly, the way her gaze darted toward the floor before meeting mine, it all gave her away. I stayed standing, towering over her, my arms crossed to keep from trembling. "Where were you this afternoon?" I asked, forcing my voice to remain calm, steady. My eyes stayed locked on hers, daring her to look away. She blinked, clearly caught off guard by the directness of the question. For a moment, she stammered, searching for words. Then, as if flipping a switch, she regained her composure. At the office, she said smoothly, her voice just a bit too casual. Meetings ran long. You know how it is. She even managed a weak smile, as though trying to sell me on the idea of her busy, professional day. I watched her closely, saw the slight clench of her jaw, the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. It was all so rehearsed, so transparent. I let her think she'd gotten away with it for just a moment, then leaned forward slightly, my voice dropping lower. Really? I said, my tone sharper than I intended, but I didn't care. Because the tracker I placed in your purse says you were at a hotel across town. Her reaction was immediate and visceral. The color drained from her face, her breath catching audibly in her throat. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her lips parted, then closed again, as if she were physically struggling to form a response. For once, the lies didn't come easily. I didn't move, didn't speak, just waited. The silence between us stretched thin, heavy with the weight of her exposed betrayal. She finally managed to stammer, "A tracker? You put a tracker in my purse?" Her voice wavered, laced with both shock and indignation, as if I was the one in the wrong. She stared at me, wide-eyed, caught somewhere between disbelief and panic. "That's right," I replied evenly, refusing to let her shift the focus. "And the recordings from your car? They tell me all I need to know." Her mouth snapped shut, her hands gripping the edge of the couch so tightly her knuckles turned white. She looked down at her lap, her composure crumbling bit by bit. I could see her struggling to come up with something, anything, that might save her, but the truth was too big to ignore now. Finally, she looked up at me, her eyes searching mine, but all I gave her was a cold, steady gaze. I watched as the realization washed over her. There was no way out this time, no lie that could explain away what I already knew. She'd built her web of deceit carefully, but it had unraveled completely, and now she was left exposed, with nothing to shield her from the truth. The silence dragged on, and still, I waited. I wanted to hear what she'd say next, wanted to see how she'd try to justify it all. But deep down, I already knew that no words could repair what she'd broken. She sat there, stunned, her face shifting between shock and indignation. You put a tracker in my purse?" she finally managed, her voice barely a whisper. The tone was one I'd never heard from her before, caught somewhere between disbelief and outrage. It almost made me laugh, the way she zeroed in on my tracking her rather than on her own betrayal. "That's right," I replied calmly. "I put a tracker in your purse, and I listened to the recordings from your car. I know everything, Kayla. Every lie, every little detail you tried to hide. I know exactly where you've been, and who you've been there with." She looked away, guilt breaking through the mask she wore so well. For a moment, I thought she might apologize, that she'd drop the act and finally admit to it. But instead, she clenched her fists, looking back at me with narrowed eyes, a flash of defiance sparking in them. "You invaded my privacy," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "This is unbelievable. I can't believe you would go behind my back like this, spying on me like I'm some sort of criminal. Maybe if you'd actually trusted me instead of sneaking around, we wouldn't be having this conversation." It was a stunning twist, even for her, and I couldn't help but shake my head. She turned it around, making herself the victim, painting my actions as the real betrayal. I almost admired her nerve, almost, but I stayed calm, the anger simmering just beneath the surface, waiting for her to run out of excuses. I took a slow breath, steadying myself, refusing to let her twist things around. "You're right, Kayla," I replied, keeping my voice low. "Maybe I shouldn't have had to spy on my own wife. But here we are. I wouldn't have needed trackers or recordings if you hadn't been sneaking around behind my back in the first place." She scoffed, crossing her arms, still clinging to her defiance. "You're just paranoid. You don't know what you're talking about. Maybe you heard some things out of context. There's nothing going on. He's just a friend." Her words sounded hollow, even to her, and I could see she was running out of places to hide. I wasn't buying any of it, and I could tell she knew it. "A friend?" I said, allowing myself a bitter laugh. "Friends don't meet at hotels in the middle of the day. They don't whisper to each other in cars and sneak around behind their families." For a moment, her face crumbled, her resolve faltering. She opened her mouth, closed it again, and finally looked down, her voice softening, as if a flicker of remorse had finally crept in. "It wasn't supposed to go this far. It was just a distraction, something to feel alive again. You wouldn't understand. I felt my stomach twist, her words hitting harder than any lie she told. There it was, the truth. Not just the betrayal, but the dismissiveness, the implication that our life together hadn't been enough for her. She continued, eyes averted, voice barely above a whisper. It just happened. I didn't plan any of this, I swear. But things just got so routine between us, and I felt like I was disappearing. I thought this would be harmless. I stared at her, struggling to understand the logic she'd used to justify all of this. She made it sound so trivial, as if betraying her family had been some casual way to find herself. I couldn't believe the words coming out of her mouth. Harmless, I repeated, shaking my head. How could you possibly think this was harmless? She bit her lip, as if finally realizing how empty her excuse sounded. But then she stiffened, a flicker of defiance returning to her gaze. You were never there, Jack. It was always work, or the house, or our son. And what about me? I didn't feel seen, like I was just a fixture in the background of your life. She spoke the words like an accusation, her frustration rising as if I was the one who'd wronged her. It was almost surreal, hearing her try to put the blame on me. For years, I'd done everything to make sure she and our family had a good life, that we had security, stability. I'd made sacrifices, big and small, for her and for us. And now, all of that effort was twisted into some kind of flaw. I could feel the sting of betrayal digging deeper, not just for what she'd done, but for the way she so easily rewrote our life together to justify it. I took a steadying breath, feeling a bitterness rise that I'd never felt before. You really believe that, don't you? I asked quietly. That somehow, because I was working hard to build a life for us, you were entitled to this? To just slip away and live a double life whenever you felt overlooked? She flinched at my words, but her expression remained firm, almost stubborn. I didn't think it would get this far, Jack. I thought I'd be able to pull back before anyone got hurt. She seemed to hesitate, her confidence wavering. It was just supposed to be something for myself, something separate. Separate? I repeated, my voice low. You really thought you could keep a marriage together and still have a secret life on the side? That's not a marriage, Kayla. That's pretending. That's lying. And what hurts more than anything is that you didn't care about the damage this would do to us, or to our son. For the first time, I saw her confidence truly falter. Her face softened, a hint of regret breaking through. But there was no apology, no real remorse, only a look of mild disappointment. Like she regretted being caught, not what she'd done. It was painfully clear she wasn't ready to own up to the depth of her betrayal, let alone make it right. I knew then that I couldn't keep fighting for someone who didn't see the damage she'd done. A long silence stretched between us, heavy with everything that hadn't been said. I could feel my resolve harden with each passing second. There was no turning back now. The trust we once had was shattered, and I didn't see any way to repair it. I looked at her, truly looked at her, and realized that the woman sitting across from me was no longer the person I'd married. Somewhere along the line, she had chosen a path that led her away from us, away from the life we had built. Finally, I spoke, my voice steady, though the weight of my words felt final. I can't do this anymore, Kayla. I've tried to understand, tried to believe that we could fix this. But this, I gestured between us, whatever it's become, isn't something I recognize, and it's not something I can live with. She sat there, stunned, her expression shifting from defiance to shock. You're leaving? She asked, as though she hadn't considered that this would be the outcome. I nodded, feeling a strange mix of sadness and relief, the first real clarity I'd felt in a long time. I have to, I replied. Not just for myself, but for our son, too. He deserves to grow up in a home where there's honesty, where he can see what real commitment looks like. I stood up, feeling lighter than I had in weeks. You made your choice, and now I'm making mine. Without another word, I walked out, leaving her to face the consequences of her actions alone. And for the first time in a long time, I felt at peace, ready to start again on my own terms.